Who don't know me, my name is Kristen Dunsmore. Today we'll be kind of just discussing conditioning as it pertains to powerlifting specifically. So I'm just going to assume that people on here are not a marathon runner and they want to, incorporate resistance training to their endurance program. Everyone here is strong and they want to be stronger, and well, how can I implement some conditioning work without it interfering with my strength? So just a quick little background about myself. I'm a powerlifting coach. I've been coaching for the past 6 years now. I'm also an athlete. I played basketball, soccer growing up, and I've been powerlifting for a good portion of about 8 years, on and off now. So I have my master's from exercise science from Syracuse University. I'm actually back in school for my PhD. So that's in health and human performance. So obviously I like to nerd out to this stuff. I think Tony does too. So we have that in common. Just some of my best lifts. So this was from USAPL Nationals about a month ago. Me competing right before I pulled my 215 deadlift. So just a brief little bio about myself. All right, so what is conditioning? And I like to say, just for powerlifters, it's like a sexy term for cardio, just because like cardio just sounds like bad. Like who wants to do that, right? So unlike, when you can measure muscular strength, via a 1RM, there's no, conditioning has no measurable outcome that translates to all circumstances. And so what I mean by that is that conditioning is going to vary depending on the athlete. Obviously, CrossFitters' goals are going to be different than powerlifting. And if you're track and field or football, they're probably going to be very different. So it kind of just depends on your goal. So conditioning is going to be task specific, so your sport and your overall goal. So for powerlifting, that is going to either be just improving your cardiovascular fitness, your health, general health and well-being. If you have to cut weight for your meet, maybe you're trying to reduce body fat, or just improve your overall work capacity. And basically what that means is that the ability to perform a repetitive, technically proficient sport skill without inducing some sort of excessive fatigue. So let's see. There's, in general, there's two, I guess, what we like to call like forms of conditioning. And it's broadly categorized by the relative intensity. So we know there's low intensity steady state, which is going to be, your long duration, working at a constant rate, no minimal rest, but there's not a lot of force required. There's going to be low RPE, which means you could probably just have a phone conversation and you're not out of breath. And so the nice thing about that is that it's probably easy to do, doesn't really require a significant amount of skill, and you can easily recover from. So on the opposite end, the more intense is going to be our high intensity interval training. And that's going to be your intense intervals followed by periods of rest. And that the ratio can vary. So maybe like 10 seconds all out followed by a minute, or maybe you're doing a 1 to 2 rest to work ratio. But in general, it's very high bouts and then followed by a rest period. And then you repeat that over a certain amount of times. So it's going to generate or require a little bit of higher muscular force, higher RPE. And because of that, we can't really sustain that for over a long period of time. But the nice thing about doing some sort of HIIT training is that it's going to be more time efficient as opposed to doing, running for any sort of low intensity for 40 minutes. You could probably do it in 10. So those are kind of the two differences between the two. All right, so I'm sure everyone's probably seen this before. Like cardio, we, for whatever reason, we always have this, like, it's gotten a bad rap, especially for powerlifters. It's like, no, I can't do this. It's going to kill my gains. Like, stay away, right? Like, we don't do cardio. And so why is it, like, where did this idea that cardio was bad for powerlifting? And so this is just, we won't go into too much detail here, but this is just kind of like a brief overview of the energy systems. So the phosphagen system, usually in general, 8 to 12 seconds, very high rate of ATP production. And some of these examples are going to be lifting weights. So this is, your powerlifting, weightlifting, doing like a 100-meter sprint, jumping, things that involve like very high intense energy in a very short amount of time. So obviously these are something that we could not do over a long period of time. So on the opposite end of that, there is going to be your oxidative or aerobic system. And this is going to be 3 minutes up to, a couple of hours. It doesn't really require a lot of energy, and you can sustain this for a long period of time. So this is going to be, and these are kind of like extremes, but triathlons, cross-country skiing, running, 15-meter swim, 1,500-meter swim. But you can see that these are very, very different, right? And then your anaerobic glycolysis is going to be kind of somewhere in the middle. So maybe a little bit of HIIT training could be considered in this anaerobic glycolysis energy system. So, all right. So the reason that powerlifting or strength training and endurance have gotten this bad rap is that, as you can see in that previous diagram, that they're pretty much on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So the idea is that incorporating some sort of endurance aerobic exercise is going to result in overreaching because it's going to stimulate competing adaptations and therefore a greater interference effect. And I think Laura may have kind of touched on her idea of overreaching. And I would say that I have to agree that for powerlifters, in most cases, you're probably not overtraining. This concept is probably apply more to, like the American football player who's doing 3-a-days or 2-a-days, or they're doing their practice on the field and then they're going into the weight room and then they're doing, their sport, whatever, like position that they compete or in football, right? So I wouldn't be too concerned about overreaching in most cases, but just kind of to give you an idea of where that idea came from. So if you look at some of the studies, and I would definitely recommend, if you are interested in the research, this Wilson, this was a meta-analysis that was done in 2012, probably to date one of, I think, the best so far. It'd be kind of cool to see what they've done, over the past, 9 years. But what they found is that this like interference effect largely depends on the type, the duration, frequency, and timing of your cardio. So this slide right here, this was taken from the paper itself. And this is the duration. You can see there's kind of like this dose-dependent effect on the duration that you're performing your endurance-focused exercise. So, after 20, 30 minutes, you begin to start seeing this slow decline up to, 60 minutes, where there's probably a pretty significant reduction in hypertrophy, strength, and power, which is obviously what we care about. Also the type. So in this right here, sorry if my dogs they're napping, they might start waking up soon. The type, so in this case, you can see that they compared running to cycling, and there was a greater reduction in performance while running compared to cycling. So that kind of shows you that it's going to depend on the type of exercise that you're doing. And as you can see too, also if your goal is to a reduction in body fat, then maybe you want to do more running. So the idea is that it kind of just depends on your goal. All right, so this slide was about the frequency. Again, there's kind of like this dose-dependent response to frequency of endurance training. And here you can see that like after, 3 days, anything more than that, you start to see like a greater drop off in the hypertrophy, strength, and power. So this is a study, this was done by Hickson in 1980. And just to kind of show you that it takes a lot in order to see these decrements. Again, these were also in like not trained lifters, so kind of be mindful of that. But this study, they had subjects that were broken down into 3 different groups. So they had a strength training only group that was training, 5 days a week, doing your typical barbell back squat and other like resistance exercise. And then they had their endurance only group, and they trained for about 6 days a week. 3 of those days consisted of running, and then the other 3 days consisted of cycling. And so the cycling bout was kind of like the more HIIT interval training. So it was like 5 bouts, 5 minutes, kind of working towards their VO2 max, followed by 2 minutes of rest. And then they would repeat that. And then the other 3 days would be up to a 40-minute run. So they started the first few weeks at 30 minutes, and then they kind of progressed. So the strength and endurance training group basically did both training sessions for the 10 weeks. And so Dr. Hickson, he stated that the goal was to exclusively increase leg strength. So like when you look at this probably, I mean, in my mind, I was like, damn, that sucks. Like, I don't know if I'd want to do this. But what they really found was that there really wasn't this loss in strength that you would think. They saw similar improvements in quadricep hypertrophy. They did measure like the way that they measured it was like just with like a tape measure and measuring circumference, which, is fine. But they also had similar increases in VO2 max and strength. So you can see that there was not as much of a difference as a lot of us would initially think. Again, they were kind of more novice, so take that into account. But overall, I think that, this idea that cardio is bad we need to rethink our thinking about that. So, and they did also, and that wasn't 19,080. I apologize for that. They also did see a greater reduction in body fat loss when they're incorporating both strength and endurance. So that's another thing to consider. So why is this important, right? Like why do we care? Because when you think about powerlifting, your goal is to hit a 1 rep max. That's almost exclusively using the anaerobic system. So, a lot of people think, well, we're not really using the aerobic system. It's not really important. Like it really doesn't matter for powerlifting. But it can indirectly impact. So when you think about, it can impact how hard you're able to train. And so therefore it can impact how you perform on the platform. So what are, some of the benefits of conditioning? Well, if you're incorporating some cardio into your workouts, you're going to have a faster recovery between sets. And I say may reduce injury risk because you're not going to do cardio and it's not going to reduce injury risk. But if you're able to have a higher quality session due to lower fatigue, because fatigue can, potentially impact your risk of injury. Well, if you can lower your perception of fatigue, well, conditioning may reduce that risk. So it also improves work capacity and training tolerance, your ability to handle training load. And this is something that maybe not directly for powerlifting, but especially as we get older, right? Like there's other things that come into play here that beyond just being strong AF. So just incorporating some sort of cardio is important just for overall health, reduce cardiovascular and metabolic health. So I think, it's time to look beyond just being strong. I think being a well-rounded athlete is going to be important and have a huge, effect on your performance overall and just kind of long-term performance. So I say a well-rounded athlete and just, not feeling like an unathletic meathead. I like to be able to move around and not feel like crap all the time. And so, maybe that just going into the gym and just feeling better and you're able to enjoy your workout, like those are all going to play a role in your performance. So, so this is the American Medical Association. This is kind of what their general activity guidelines are. Now, again, this is probably more for general population, but if you're a coach or an athlete or have an athlete who's kind of like in the beginner, this is kind of just like a baseline goal to have them start. So low intensity would be 150 low intensity aerobic exercise, which actually equates to about 30 minutes, 5 times a week. And it's actually, so when they say physical activity, I mean, they consider walking your dog around the block or like walking in the grocery store. So this like doesn't need to be done all in one sitting. This can be performed throughout the day. So this is also something to think about, but then a good baseline to start off of. And then for your high intensity physical activity, a minimum of 75 minutes. So that also equates to about 15 minutes, 5 days per week. And you can also combine both intensities to meet these guidelines. So which is better, right? Like is HIIT or is low intensity steady state cardio better for performance? And the answer to this question is it depends, right? So when you're working with an athlete or yourself, you want to kind of consider their training background. Do they have a background in sports? Maybe if they're sprints, and they have a background in track and field, and you want to incorporate some sprint training, like, that's pretty similar to the squat pattern. 10 out of 10 recommend. I myself am not a sprint coach, and it's also a little bit more technical. So, if you're trying to have someone with minimal background trying to incorporate sprint training, there's kind of this like risk reward, like, could you increase their risk of injury? Like maybe just something to consider. What kind of equipment do they have available? So, sled pushes are great, but if they don't have it, well, like then it doesn't really matter. So maybe in that case, just going for a walk is going to be okay. What's their training goal? So if their goal is fat loss, maybe you want to incorporate some running. If you're like me and you want to get strong AF, then maybe you want to do something that's going to mimic closer to a squat pattern. So such as sprinting, but if you're not a sprinter like myself, I would recommend doing something like the stationary bike. And I almost incorporate like stationary cycling to almost all of my lifters. Also, what's their training history or their injury history? So, if some, the cycle bothers their knees, don't incorporate it. So maybe something like the rower machine is going to be a little bit lower impact, isn't going to put as much stress. So these are all things to consider. And then finally, what's their preference, right? Like if you don't like running, you don't want to do HIIT training because it just sucks. Don't do it. So all these things, factors are going to play a role, and definitely something to think about when you're incorporating conditioning. So kind of like to put this all together, because this is what we want to know. It's like, well, okay, well, that's cool, but how can I incorporate this into my own training so that I can, be healthy and still be strong and not have to worry about losing strength in the meantime. So these are some recommendations. So perform your conditioning after a resistance training session and not before. And ideally, if possible, perform it at least 3 hours apart. But again, not everyone has that time. So if you don't, then just do it after your resistance training session. Or if possible, you can do conditioning on a non-training day. Or, if you're doing an upper body focus day, then maybe you want to do some of your, cycling on an upper body focus day. And the reason for this is because the mTOR signaling pathway, which is the mammalian target of rapamycin, and no one needs to know that. But basically what I like to call that, it's the muscle building pathway. So this is the pathway that's activated when you're resistance training or consuming like protein. This is the muscle building pathway, right? So like we want that. And so what happens is when you're doing like a kind of intense exercise, it's kind of the mTOR pathway is temporarily impaired. So if you're doing an intense like HIIT training exercise, I would highly recommend doing that separately, just so that you can kind of reap the benefits and not have to worry about, killing your gains. Oops, go back. Okay. So select a modality that closely mimics your sport to limit the possibility of competing adaptations. So if you saw in the previous slide where you're talking about the type of exercise, and it showed that there was less or almost no reduction in strength doing the cycling compared to running, I would highly recommend if you're a power lifter, doing a modality that kind of mimics a squat pattern. So in this case, like that's why I said I really like the cycling. I really like sprints as well, but if you're not a sprinter, then maybe the cycling, it doesn't really require as much skill. So that's usually why I recommend cycling. If you're doing low intensity, under 30 minutes. I really don't see powerlifters doing a lot. This is probably more of an issue with like the bodybuilding community where they're doing 2 hours of cardio. I think most people, this isn't going to be an issue. If you are doing HIIT training, you probably want to keep that on like to 15 minutes or under. And if you do perform cardio, I would recommend kind of keeping it to 2 days a week. 2 to 3 days a week is probably like that happy medium. And then finally, like one thing to consider is that like our bodies, like we adapt. We are highly adaptable human beings. And so if you're incorporating a cardio or any conditioning program, you'd program that and progress it the same way that you would your resistance training. So you want to start with like the minimal dosage and then kind of work your way up as needed. I know I made the mistake once of deciding that I want to start doing conditioning. And so I went and I did like some sprints in the park. And then I went and did some box jumps and some broad jumps. And I was like feeling great. I was like, yes, like I'm going to be an athlete, until the next day that I had deadlifts and I couldn't get it off the ground. So not that I thought it was bad. I'd probably I just did too much too soon. And so you kind of want to be cognizant of that, is like kind of work your way in. Don't be like me and think that, you haven't done sprints and these kind of workouts in 3 years and you're just going to go in and everything's going to be great the way that it was before. So just, think about that as well. So that's kind of it on my presentation. This is some of the references. If you go back, I think Stronger by Science by Greg Nuckols had some really great articles on concurrent training. And I would definitely recommend reading those if you are interested and have the time. So did anybody have any questions?
Great job, Kristen. Very well done.
Thank you. And then,
Yeah, I have some questions for you.
yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. Within the research or within just your own practice as a coach, have you seen any sex differences in modalities or handling of volume between men and women? Of like maybe men are more predisposed to create more muscle damage when they run, so biking may be better for them, where women may be able to get. Have you noticed anything like that within your athletes?
With my not sex differences, I think like it kind of, I would say, comes down to like the preference. So I like to keep it open with my athletes. So if someone enjoys running, they're doing things that they enjoy, and we tend to do things that we enjoy that we're better at anyway.
Mhm.
So I know like I haven't really looked at in endurance exercise, but like definitely with resistance training, it does seem that women can handle more training volume. But again, that's in resistance training. So kind of remains to be seen with endurance focus.
Yeah, definitely. One of the interesting things about that is like women can handle more volume acutely, but then when working with women, when they have too much volume chronically, they start to have a lot of hormonal disruptions and they start to have a lot of issues with their blood work. So it's an interesting dynamic between like acute and chronic. And that leads me to
Yeah.
my next question, if the interference effect, right?
Mhm.
Um, if you look at the research, right, most concurrent programs work in that first like 6 to 8 weeks of training. They can get both stronger and in better shape.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, magically, this interference effect kicks in, right? So
Mhm.
my question would be like, do you really think that there is an interference effect, or do you think it's just poor management of fatigue?
Probably, that's actually what I was gonna say is that, I mean, you kind of see the same thing with resistance training, right? Where,
Right.
like training sessions going good, and then all of a sudden you kind of like, where we know it's like, okay, well, we probably need to like deload or do some like pivot week or whatever. And I think it's kind of like the same thing where if you're including some sort of cardio and conditioning, you still want to program that as, similar in a similar way that you would your resistance training. And so I think some of the like those, after that 6 weeks, it's like they're just going up.
Right.
And like, yeah, at some point you probably need to just take a step back, and then continue. So I would definitely say, in my opinion, I would say a lot of it may be fatigue. But then it also depends on what kind of are they trying to do a powerlifting meet and a marathon in the same time? Like,
Right. Right.
well, in that case, yeah, there's probably going to be some interference.
Yeah. Yeah. And then my last question, and Tasha, if you have anything, chime in afterwards, is it looks like the modalities that tend to be best are the ones that are non-weight bearing. Have you seen any research on like swimming or anything like that that can be added in that's very much restorative in nature, but can also have some
Yeah.
great condition and benefits?
Yeah, and I love swimming. So that's I would highly recommend if swimming is your way to go, like for sure do it. I usually just recommend the the stationary bike, number one, just because it's like
Yeah,
every gym has
has
it.
one,
So
right?
yeah, and so yeah, I mean swimming I is great if you can swim, right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's
so I'd say swimming is still a skill too. So that depends. But yeah, swimming is the way to go, I think, if
awesome.
you have access to it. So
Right. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Tasha, any questions? I don't think so. I think she's good.
all good.
All right.